Henry V begins with a complicated political situation. One is the church's response to a parliamentary petition by the Commons, remember that's the group that authorized Richard II's deposition in the first place, to take church land and property. The second political situation is Henry's claim to the French throne. Let's begin with the first. The church is under duress. According to Holinshed, that's Shakespeare's source, a petition in Parliament by the Commons was put forth so as, to quote from the Chronicle, temporal lands devotedly given to religious orders be seized into the king's hands. Why? Because all that land could, let's continue Holinshed, maintain to the honor of the king in defense of the realm 15 earls, 1,500 knights, 6,200 squires, and 100 almshouses for relief of the poor, as well as 20,000 pounds for the king. Naturally, the church is up in arms, and were, to quote Holinshed again, determined to assay or find ways, all the ways to put by and overthrow this bill. Shakespeare represents this problem with a conspiracy between the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of Ely. Ely, but how, my lord, shall we resist it now? Canterbury, it must be thought on. If it pass against us, we lose the better half of our possession, for all the temporal lands which men devout by testament have given to the church would they strip from us, being valued thus, as much as would maintain to the king's honor full 15 earls and 1,500 knights, 6,200 good esquires, and to relief of lazars, or lepers, and weak age, of indigent, faint souls, past corporal toil, in other words, poor people who can no longer work, in other words, the elderly, 100 almshouses right well supplied, and to the coffers of the king beside, 1,000 pounds by the year. Thus runs the bill. That's the petition. This would drink deep. 'Twould drink the cup and all. But what prevention? So what did you notice? That Shakespeare put into verse the prose of his source. In other words, we're seeing an example of versification, where prose is turned into verse, or in this case, blank verse, which is unrhymed iambic pentameter. By the way, invented by my favorite poet of this period, Surrey, the great innovator. But before we get into the Salic law, notice that it's the church's idea. The church officials confirm that Hal has changed. Never was such a sudden scholar made. In other words, Henry V is now a serious person who studies now. Never came reformation in a flood, with such a heady current scouring faults. Imagine reformation, a flood. He's been cleansed through hard scrubbing, nor never hydra-headed willfulness so soon did lose his seat, and all at once, as in this king. We are blessed in the change. You can hear the language of the previous plays, right? The reformation of Hal's soliloquy in part 1, the Hydra monsters of Henry IV, part 2. Hal, because he's more serious, is less swayed by the riots of the people, as represented by the Commons. That same group that his father, Henry IV, relied upon in Richard II and described in Henry IV, part 2. But my good lord, how now for mitigation of this bill, this petition urged by the Commons? Doth his majesty incline to it, or no? Is the king going to go with this plan? Canterbury, he seems indifferent, or rather swaying more upon our part than cherishing the exhibitors against us. So for greater influence over the king, the church is offering money for Henry V to press his case against France. Now, what is his case? The severals or particulars and unhidden passages, it means the passages are indisputable, of his true titles to come certain dukedoms, and generally, without exception, to the crown and seat of France, derived from Edward, his great-grandfather. The king genuinely wants to know if his claim for the French crown is legitimate. Now note, in the Q1 Henry V, neither the prologue that opens the play nor the conspiratorial scene between the church officials is present. All you get is Henry V, our friend Hal, earnestly engaging his officials about his rights to the French throne. In other words, we see an earnest Hal seeking legitimacy in ways that Henry IV can only dream about. Q1 makes the whole claim innocent. But in the first folio versions, the versions that are usually published, it's more complicated. There are doubts to the legitimacy of his claims. But there are also questions of legitimacy for the French claims too. So what is the situation? Henry V's claim to the French crown is founded in his descent from Edward III, the same Edward III mentioned in Richard II when the Duchess of Gloucester reminds John of Gaunt of his royal blood. You remember that scene. So what was his claim? That he was the great-grandson of King Philip III. Now this is important because all of the kings up to the plays Charles VI and Henry V come ultimately from Philip III in some way, but from two different lines. Henry V from Philip III's first son, Philip IV, and Charles VI from Philip's second son, the Count of Valois. Now the French lords in the play claim Salic law, or the law Salic. That's an old Frankish law from 500 that was established by one of the early Frankish kings, Clovis. Notice I say Frankish, not French. Remember, we're now in the 15th century in this play. And the Salic law claimed that no woman could inherit thrones, fiefs, or communal property. In other words, something related to the kingdom. Henry V is claiming the crown through a maternal line. That's why all of this Salic law matters. It was an invention to justify a questionable seizure of the crown to avoid English lines. Now remember, Shakespeare is writing for an audience that does not hold much credence with the French in general, and in particular with this law of succession. Remember, who is the monarch of England at this time of the play's writing in 1599? Queen Elizabeth. So the female line is real in English monarchy. King, sure we thank you. My learned lord, we pray you to proceed and justly and religiously, in other words, be truthful, unfold why the law Salic that they have in France, or should not bar us in our claim. But he warns those church officials, no tricks. And God forbid, my dear and faithful Lord, that you should fashion, wrest, or bow your reading. In other words, bend the reading to the way you want it to read, like the Wife of Bath does in Canterbury Tales. Or nicely charge your understanding soul with open titles miscreate. In other words, he doesn't want them cheating the law. He doesn't want them to be lawyers, whose right suits not in native colors with the truth. So the claim has to be real. It has to have native colors, not rhetorical colors. Number 13 again. But in thinking about the quarto and the folio versions, what do we know? Well, in the first folio, that claim to the French throne coincides with the church's desire to squash a bill or petition in Parliament, remember? However, in the Q1 Henry V, this conspiratorial part is not in play, even though it is in the first folio. That first folio with the conspiracy taints this enterprise. It also sows doubt, even in Henry, over his legitimacy, at least in the case of the French crown. So we're back to Richard II and Henry IV, Part 1. Henry's warning them because there will be moral consequences to any political games. For God doth know how many soldiers now in health, who are alive and in good health, shall drop their blood in approbation, will die in confirming this claim. That means people will die. Now, the Archbishop of Canterbury's response, that long dissertation on the dubious history of Salic law, is an absolute tour de force of Shakespeare turning the prose of his source, Holinshed's Chronicle, into poetry. The very words of that supposed law are these: in terram salicam mulieres ne succedent, that is to say, into the Salic land let no women succeed, which the French glossers, that's interpreters, like I'm glossing the text for you, expound or interpret the realm of France, and that this law was made by King Pharamond, whereas yet their own authors affirm that the land Salic is in Germany between the rivers of Elbe and Saale, etc. Now notice how Shakespeare takes this long prose passage and turns it into blank verse, that is, unrhymed iambic pentameter. Then hear me, gracious sovereign, and your peers that owe yourselves, your lives and services to this imperial throne, there is no bar to make against your highness's claim to France, but this which they produce from Pharamond, in terram salicam mulieres ne succedat. No woman shall succeed in Salic lands, which Salic land the French unjustly gloze to be the realm of France, and Pharamond, the founder of this law and female bar. Yet their own authors faithfully affirm that the land Salic is in Germany between the floods or rivers of Saale and of Elbe. You can imagine how boring this would appear on stage. All of this prose translated into verse. Now, if you watch Sir Laurence Olivier's Henry V film that was made right after World War II was over, he has an ingenious solution. He plays the whole scene as comedy. The comedy enhances the conspiratorial elements, and it also darkens the church's declaration. Gracious Lord, stand for your own, unwind your bloody flag. It makes you think of Henry's younger brother, John of Lancaster, when he said about the Archbishop of York in Henry IV, Part 2, my Lord of York, it better showed with you when that your flock, assembled by the bell of the church, encircled you to hear with reverence your exposition on the holy text, the Bible, than now to see you here, an iron man talking, because York is now wearing armor. And in the next episode, we're going to look at the soldiers themselves and how they respond to these wars of succession.
Alright guys, don't forget to like and subscribe and ring that notification bell.